So environmental racism, at least the way we understand it in the United States, is where there are companies and governments that put poisonous things next to black and brown and poor communities. In the United States, a oil refinery or a nuclear plant, something very dangerous that's poisoning the soil, the water, the air, is 80 times more likely to be next to black communities and 100 times more likely to be in a poor community. It's never in a white community, it's never in a wealthy community, but it's also always deemed necessary for society. So our communities bear the burden of the poison and the toxins, while all of society gets the benefit of the energy. Environmental racism really talks about what's going in the soil, the water, the air, but it's connected to climate justice because the same industries that poison the water and the soil and the air are also emitting greenhouse gases at very large amounts. So they're killing our people in the immediate and they're killing the planet in the long term.
And how environment racism impacts black community in US?
There's no better example of how environmental racism impacts black communities than the 2020-2021 COVID virus. What we saw is that if a community lived near poisonous air, their bodies were so broken that they couldn't fight off the COVID-19 virus. And so we saw our communities dying at higher rates just because they live next to these polluting facilities. The environmental racism of putting those facilities next to us killed us when the pandemic came at numbers higher than anything any other community really had to deal with. The only other community that had higher deaths was the Native Americans, the indigenous communities, and they have equally the same kind of environmental racism, usually around mining and nuclear right next to their communities. These poisonous things slowly weaken our body, and when pandemics come, we don't have the ability to fight them.
And Colette, in Brazil has a discussion about environment racism, but Brazilian government denied this concept, says that environment racism is a blah 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 that doesn't exist, that we are creating racism because we see racism in everything. Yeah. How sounds it to you? And the same thing happens in US?
Yes. The governments never want to admit racism. To admit racism is to admit that they have done something intentionally. But we all have to take the time to be honest. This climate crisis requires us to be truthful and honest about where we've come from and where we have to go. Brazil was colonized just like the US was, and all of our communities felt the impacts of racism just by the mere fact of being black. We were legally dehumanized. Our humanity was taken away from us, pulled us from Africa and put us into a labor market for a colonial power. This is the basis of the US, this is the basis of Brazil. Racism. It's hard for people to admit racism because they think you're calling them racist. They may or may not be racist, but that's not the point. The point is that the system is rooted in racial inequality, and it is working exactly as it's supposed to. It devalues us based on our proximity to blackness, and it values us based on our proximity to whiteness. And that's what we have to really address. You can't do it with a lot of fear, and you can't do it with a lot of guilt. You do have to do it with truth, and then our solutions and the way we go forward have to acknowledge the past and make sure that the systems we're creating for the future don't recreate that.
Colette, everyone in the world is facing the climate changes, but some groups and some countries and some spaces feels much more the changes than others.
Yes.
What we are seeing here in this copy is that the South, global South, is not here as should be here. And how sounds it to you, and how is important to face these global inequalities?
This COP has been disappointing at best. We moved, my delegation from the United States invited folks from West Africa to join us, and at the very last minute, they couldn't get on their airplanes because they didn't have the correct visas. Some of them didn't get their visas back in time. Some countries aren't here because the British government didn't complete the visa process, and they've been just changing access based on who had access to coronavirus vaccine. Some countries, if you were from the West, for example, from the United States, you could come in without a visa and with a vaccine from your country. But if you were in another country, they challenged whether or not your vaccine was even valid. What does that mean? If their vaccine isn't valid enough to come to the COP, what are you giving people? What is the problem? But more than anything, I think it's really sad how many Black and brown and indigenous communities are not here. This was a very difficult process to get into and navigate. This was a almost impossible process if you were coming from an African nation or an Asian nation to get a visa to come in here. We're not represented, and the solutions of this very important moment are going forward without us. That means we are not included. That means we are not at the table, and that means it's very likely that the solutions are going to be unjust and more of the same.
Part of these discussions here in the copy is about the carbon market. And some people, like from the market, put that as the main important discussion here. What's your opinion? Is that the main important discussion?
No, carbon markets are, we're dealing with corporations and powers. Corporations and governments are not thinking about people. They're still looking at profits. They're looking at what technologies can we put in place, what market instruments can we put in place to make money while we address the climate crisis. This is the wrong approach. The climate crisis wasn't created because of money. It was created because of an economic system that is unjust. If we're gonna attack this thing, if we're gonna make any advancement, we're gonna have to get to the root of our economic system that values profit over people. How do we change this? How do we change the mind of governments and corporations away from making money to having healthier communities, to having stronger people, to having people who live long and healthy lives in a sustainable way? This isn't even on the table. Everyone here is looking to make money, and Black and brown folks in Brazil and in the US know what happens when the globe gets together and figures out how to make money off of our lives. I mean, this is a crucial moment for us. Everything that has happened in the past is happening again now. We should be very afraid of what could possibly happen if we don't get our people engaged in this issue. Climate impacts Black lives. It is impacting Black lives all across this globe, and we have to stand together to really put the real issue on the table. White supremacy, colonialism, inequality, this is what we have to address if we're gonna address the climate crisis. Technological solutions are a false solution. Carbon capture, carbon markets, these are things that are gonna continue to poison and kill us while other people make money. Very few people, by the way. It's not like lots of people are making money. Those 1% will make money off of our lives. No good.
How do you think that we can achieve climate justice in the world?
Achieving climate justice is going to require us to have the courage to be honest about who we are, how we got here, and where we want to go. I'm really excited to be talking with folks in Brazil and other places because I think Black folks around the globe really have to unite. We can't be lulled into thinking that if we achieve a certain academic level or if we achieve a certain level of success that our exceptionalism will keep us safe. It's going to kill our people if we don't come together. So I think in order to achieve climate justice, we're gonna have to really come together, be honest, take some time to heal, use some of the traditions, not just of prayers, but yes, prayers. We're gonna have to dance, we're gonna have to eat, we're gonna have to do those things that have been preserved in cultures like Brazil, in cultures like Louisiana. We're gonna have to do those things that get our courage up, get our spirits up, and connect us together, and then we have to move together.
And for closing, we're done. And how is important the knowledge of like Black people, Maroons, and some people like people of color to overcome this climate problem?
Yeah. So in the United States, and especially in the South where I live, we have the largest number of Black people because that's where slavery really took place. And I come from a Maroon community. They call them Creole. And the Creole, the Maroon communities, they have knowledge of the land. They kept their knowledge of the land from Africa. They kept it now in the New World. And we actually need them right now, not because they have some technological solutions, but because they know how to balance with the earth. What happens when you have a hurricane that takes out all the grocery stores, that floods the soil and makes it hard to eat out of the land? The old people, the Creoles, the Maroons, they know, oh, you plant these things to get the toxins out of the soil before you plant your seeds for your new food. This is old knowledge. This is environmental knowledge over many, many years that we will need. Maybe, I hope never, but maybe in a time of crisis, you're really going to need to know how to eat, how to find clean water, how to keep yourself sustained and alive. Our ancestors, the folks who are still here, these cultures that hold that, they know the answers to this. So if nothing else, while we fight, we have to re-indigenize ourselves and remember those lessons, because those lessons will help us survive.